Epics, user stories, and story points are three terms that are commonly used in Agile Project Management and some of its many methodologies like Extreme Programming, XP, and Scrum. Yet, if you are not an Agile practitioner, these terms may seem unfamiliar to you, and you may want a simple explanation of what we mean by the terms epic, user story, and story point. Let me explain. The place to start is with user stories. A user story describes something that the user wants. It is no more complex than that. A user story is a simple product description in terms of what the product needs to be able to do and for whom. So, user stories describe requirements that the users or the clients of the project expect the project to be able to deliver. The collection of all the user stories that the project has yet to deliver forms the product backlog. User stories are typically documented on cards, and each card will contain the title, a unique ID, an estimate of the work required, usually in story points, which we'll come back to shortly, a full description of the product requirement within the user story, and sometimes a list of tasks. The list of tasks will often look something like components of a work breakdown structure. The description will usually define things like the quality requirements and the scope of the product requirement, and it will often be documented in a narrative form. A good example of the narrative form that you might use is this one. And in this place we put the user type or a description of a typical user, sometimes known as a persona. So, as a user, I want to, or I want to be able to, and then we describe the action or the task that the product requirement needs to fulfill. So, as a user, I want to action so that, and then we put the benefit, the reason why we want this particular functionality or user requirement. Often we add a validation statement that takes a similar form. When and we insert the action again, this happens, and then we put down the outcome. This describes how the functionality works and of course gives us a good definition of what done will look like. So, a user story is one product requirement that the users or the client want. An epic is nothing more than a big user story, but it is so big that it can't be achieved within one iteration or one sprint. Consequently, to make it manageable, what we seek to do is to split an epic down into a number of user stories, and these user stories will be closely associated with one another. As a result, an epic is sometimes described as an oversized user story, one that is too big to handle. And within it are closely related user stories that represent smaller and often interacting product features. In reality, what represents a user story and what represents an epic is a matter of judgment. There is no clear definition of when a big user story becomes a small epic. But another term that is worth knowing is themes. In some organizations, themes represent clusters of user stories that are linked in some broader way. They are, if you like, thematically connected to one another. They all have some element of commonality. However, this doesn't mean that you will necessarily draw user stories from the same theme from a product backlog at the same time or even sequentially. Story points relate to user stories, and they are unitless measures of the amount of work required to deliver a user story, the functionality that the user wants. They're unitless because they're not necessarily measured in time or in money. They kind of scale the size of the task. And what matters is not the number of story points you give each user story. It's the relative values between the different user stories that matter. What matters is whether one user story is twice or 3 times or 4 or 5 times as big as another. When allocating story points, we usually take into account 3 main things: the amount of work required, the level of complexity of that work, the interactions between the different components of it, if you like, and also the level of risk or uncertainty concerned with doing the work. If we're working on something that could easily break, it is high risk. If we're working on something we don't understand well, it has a lot of uncertainty, and therefore will gain more story points. One of many ways of estimating story points is planning poker. And if that interests you, we've done a video on that you can take a look at. So, in understanding epics, user stories, and story points, we start with user stories, what the customer, what the client, what the users want. If a user story is too big, we call it an epic. If we've got lots that are related in some general way, we call it a theme. And if we want to estimate the size of a user story, we allocate story points to it. It's as simple as that. Please do give us a thumbs up if you've enjoyed this video. There'll be loads more great project management content, so please do subscribe to this channel and of course hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of it. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.